Hi everyone, this is Dan Clanton, and this is our mini lecture over the Gospel of Mark. First, let's talk briefly about some critical issues regarding the Gospel of Mark. First, when we ask about the authorship of Mark, we're confronted with a choice between a traditional view and a modern view. First, early Christian tradition held that a man named Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark. Simple enough. This view is based on a citation in a book called The Church History by Eusebius, which records a quotation of Papias, a bishop of Hierapolis in Asia Minor in the early 2nd century. The quotation associates a man named Mark with this document and claims that he was a follower of Peter. On the other hand, most modern critics don't accept the view of Papias that the Mark mentioned in the New Testament, or I should say the Marks mentioned in the New Testament, wrote this gospel because they don't view the Gospels as being the product of one person like Papias claims. Instead, modern gospel critics usually hold the view that, quote, the gospel authors modified anonymous traditions that gradually developed as well as written sources to create their own individualized accounts, end quote. Because of this, most scholars simply see the work as pseudonymous. That is, the early church tried to establish the legitimacy of this text by ascribing its authorship to Mark, a known follower of Peter. Even so, for the sake of convenience, we'll be referring to the author of this document as Mark in what follows. Secondly, the date. Most discussions of the date of the Gospel of Mark tend to focus on chapter 13. Now, because of the apocalyptic or eschatological tone in Mark 13, most scholars have generally posited two dates for the composition of Mark. The first of these is around 64 CE, that is, before the first Jewish revolt against Rome. In 64 CE, the persecutions of Christians by the Emperor Nero would have provided ample cause for such an apocalyptic section, some scholars claim, especially if Mark were written from Rome. On the other hand, some scholars argue that Mark is written toward the end of the Jewish war, probably closer to around 70 CE, because in their view, the end of the Jewish war and the destruction of the temple would have provided a more appropriate impetus for this section. More specifically, in Mark chapter 13, verse 14, Mark mentions the quote-unquote desolating sacrilege. And this probably refers to the Roman general Titus entering the Holy of Holies in the temple in August of 70 CE. Overall, the chronological scheme in chapter 13, I think, indicates that the time frame of the gospel is after the destruction of the temple. So my own opinion is that Mark writes around 70. Third, in terms of provenance, or where we think this gospel might have been composed, because of the preoccupation with the Jerusalem church, the temple, and the Galilee region, some scholars think that Mark was written from the Galilean region of southern Syria. However, many other scholars point out that the gospel seems to be unclear or imprecise regarding Palestinian geography, and they wind up agreeing with Papias in early Christian tradition and see Rome as the place of origin for Mark's gospel. Finally, many scholars list several possibilities for sources and or traditional material that may have been used by Mark. And the most likely of these would include the Passion narrative at the end of the gospel, and the collection of miracle stories in chapter 4, verse 35 through chapter 8, verse 26. Now that we've dealt with some basic critical issues, let's go a little bit more in depth and look at some stylistic, literary, and structural features of the gospel. And there are several literary techniques used by Mark which deserve mention. First of all, sandwiching or intercalation. Mark has a tendency to place one story inside another one. For example, the placing of Jesus' authority to forgive sins is sandwiched in the story of a healing of a paralytic. And like any good sandwich, what you're really interested in is not the bread, it's what's in between, whether that's meat, tofu, what have you. Another example, the disqualification of the temple is framed between two accounts dealing with a fig tree in chapter 11. In fact, a large portion of the gospel can be seen to be sandwiched in this way. In chapter 8, verse 22 through chapter 10, verse 52, the narrator relates details having to do with the suffering of the Son of Man and how persons should respond. The entire account is framed by two healings of blind men, one in chapter 8, verses 22 to 26, and the healing of Bartimaeus in chapter 10, verses 46 to 52. Second, threes. Mark also has a tendency to group things in threes. Three mentions of Capernaum. In chapter 3, verse 35, brother, sister, mother. How many chief disciples are there? There are three, Peter, James, and John. Who are the main enemies of Jesus in the gospel? That would be the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. How many times does Jesus predict his passion? 3. How many times do the disciples fall asleep? 3. How many times does Peter deny Jesus? 3. How many visits did Jesus and his disciples make to Jerusalem? 3. There is a consistent pattern of threes in the Gospel of Mark. Also, Mark seems to have a definite geographical framework in mind. And this geographical framework is much easier to observe if you skip ahead a few minutes in this video and take a look at the two maps I've provided for you there. One in the north, one in the south. Not only is there a sense in which Mark's Gospel has Jesus move from Galilee to Jerusalem in general, but there are more specific geographical clues in the Gospel as well. For instance, beginning in chapter 3, verse 13, all the way through chapter 8, verse 21, Jesus makes several trips back and forth the Sea of Galilee. And I love that they call it a sea. I think in the U.S. we might refer to it as a lake. In any case, these journeys represent a figurative and a symbolic journey from Jewish to Gentile territory. And it's very important to pay attention to that geography, because how Jesus acts in a Jewish area might be different than how he acts in a Gentile area, as we'll see. Fourth and finally, perhaps the most interesting literary aspect of the Gospel is the narrator's use of irony. Irony can be defined as, quote, the perception or awareness of a discrepancy or incongruity between words and their meaning, or between actions and their results, or between appearance and reality. End quote. As you may have gathered from your reading, there's irony throughout Mark's Gospel. For one thing, the disciples are shown to be completely obtuse when it comes to understanding the nature of Jesus' identity. However, demons and even a Roman centurion can recognize his identity. Because the disciples, as insiders or confidants, should be able to recognize Jesus' identity and don't, and because demons and the centurion, who as outsiders should have no clue as to his identity, but recognize him as the bringer of the kingdom, the situation is thus ironic. Also, the chief priests, scribes, and elders seem to look on Jesus as some kind of Davidic Messiah, while Pilate seems to indicate that he's the king of the Jews. The reader, by that point in the Gospel, would probably know that neither of those titles fits Jesus, but both the council and Pilate condemn Jesus for their own misconceptions, because the reader is aware of a discrepancy between the actuality of Jesus' identity and the misconceptions held by the council and Pilate. The condemnation of Jesus itself becomes ironic. I hope you enjoyed those maps. Now I'd like to take a look at three themes or emphases that we find in the gospel. The first of these is referred to by biblical scholars as the messianic secret. What we mean by that is that at many places in the gospel, Jesus tells various people and even demons not to reveal his identity as Messiah. There seem to be four main categories within this theme. So at points, Jesus issues a command to secrecy that references the kingdom of God, exorcisms, healings, and to the disciples. As you might imagine, the vast majority of these references deal with Jesus' abilities, that is, his acts of miracle working and exorcisms. However, Mark's Jesus is not to be identified primarily as a miracle worker, but rather as the bringer of the kingdom of God through his suffering and death. In other words, the kingdom won't be brought about through miraculous actions or by traditional identities. Instead, Jesus orders no one to put him into a particular box until he can reveal his own identity. When he does, we refer to those instances as recognition scenes. And here's a good way to define recognition scenes. Quote, "At one point in a novel or drama or movie, the author lets the reader or viewer have a glimpse of the protagonist's full identity, intimating thereby the final outcome of the story." End quote. So when Jesus chooses to reveal his own identity, we refer to those as recognition scenes, and they occur at several places in the Gospel of Mark. Once in chapter 9, verses 2 to 8, at what we call the Transfiguration. Once before the Jewish council in chapter 14, verses 61 to 62. And once in chapter 15, verse 39, with the centurion's confession. Why these three specific places? As we noted earlier, Mark has a tendency to group things in threes, and these three recognition scenes represent the three main groups in the gospel. The first recognition scene occurs for the benefit of the three chief disciples, Peter, James, and John. As Werner Kelber notes in his work, quote, "The transfiguration scene is therefore understood as a preview granted to the three chosen disciples of Jesus' full identity as Son of God, an identity which is yet to be fully materialized through suffering and rising." End quote. However, it seems obvious that these three disciples don't know what to do. Look in chapter 9, verse 6, quote, "He didn't know what to say, for they were all terrified." End quote. Thus, the author has included this recognition scene for two main reasons. First, to give the reader a clue to Jesus' identity, and second, to highlight even more vividly the miscomprehension of the disciples, particularly the three main disciples, Peter, James, and John. The second recognition scene occurs in front of the Jewish council. The high priest asks Jesus if he is the Messiah, and Jesus tells him, "I am." The importance of this scene is that the council would take Jesus' admission to mean that he's either a Davidic Messiah or a military Messiah or a priestly Messiah, some of the widespread messianic conceptions at this time. However, Jesus' confession, his abandonment of the messianic secret, entails a quite different notion of what it means to be the Messiah, as the reader would well know. Thus, this scene serves to highlight the inadequate conception of messiahship as held by the council. To be fair to the council, the conception of a suffering Messiah that has to die is one that is invented by the early Jewish followers of Jesus. So we wouldn't expect the High Council to understand it. The last recognition scene is especially important. It's found in chapter 15, verse 39, with the centurion's confession of Jesus' divine identity. In his work, Mark deals with three main groups: the followers of Jesus, the Jews, and the Gentiles. The first two have already been dealt with, and this third scene addresses the third group, that is, the Gentiles. The importance of this scene is to ultimately highlight the failure on the part of the disciples and the Jews to truly recognize Jesus' identity. When the centurion, an outsider, a Gentile, can perceive the nature of Jesus' identity and the others can't, the reader is shown once and for all that the kingdom won't conform to any preconceived notions. According to preconceived notions, the disciples should have been the one to get it right, and if not them, then at least the Jews. But neither of them does. And this point is emphasized by the centurion's statement, which is also another instance of irony. Thus, the messianic secret motif functions in Mark to overturn any preconceived notions we may have about the nature of discipleship, Jesus' identity, or the kingdom itself. Secondly, the blindness of the disciples. This theme should have become increasingly clear as you read through the gospel. One expects the disciples to be the ones to understand Jesus' message and teachings. After all, they're insiders. And as Jesus says in chapter 4, verse 11, quote, "To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything comes in parables." End quote. However, as the gospel proceeds, the disciples get more and more moronic, so that finally they all either abandon Jesus or deny him. In the end, Jesus dies alone, and his divine identity is recognized by a Gentile outsider. This opposition is seen most clearly in the midsection of the gospel, in chapter 8, verse 22 through chapter 10, verse 52. The journeys and the emphasis on the phrase "on the way" in this section highlights the purpose of the author. As Werner Kelber notes again, quote, "As Jesus traveled on his way, he tried to open the eyes of the disciples first and foremost to the reality of his suffering, dying, and rising. By now, the reader who has traveled along the way has come to the realization that the disciples have remained blind. The net result of this journey is not the opening of their eyes, but their incorrigible blindness. They have remained ignorant of the purpose of Jesus' mission, and for this reason cannot occupy the place and fulfill the function that was destined for them." End quote. Thus, the inadequacies of the disciples serves to highlight the uselessness of preconceived notions one may have of the way things ought to be in the kingdom. For as we'll see, the disciples are the ones who are supposed to understand better than anyone. But in the end, they have no clue as to what the kingdom is about. Finally, several commentators think that Mark had something very specific to say about the church in Jerusalem. We know that Mark mentions the same figures as Paul does in terms of the leadership of the Jerusalem church, namely James, Peter, and John. Now, even though the James in the Gospel of Mark isn't the same person, it surely can't be coincidental. If we add this piece of evidence to the fact that Mark continually degrades the three, James, Peter, and John, as well as has many negative things to say about Jerusalem, for example, chapter 13, and the temple disqualification, we begin to see a negative picture emerging of the Jerusalem church. One scholar notes that Mark's, quote, criticism of the 12, and especially of the three, and above all of Peter, could well be directed against the Jerusalem church. This same scholar also notes the tradition found in Acts chapter 1, verse 14, that the Jerusalem community honored Jesus' family, that this could have been slandered by Mark's separating of Jesus' family from the kingdom of God in the Gospel of Mark chapter 3, verses 31 to 35. Also, in the first chapter of Acts, there seems to have been some traditions about Galilean women being members of the Jerusalem church. If this is true, then Mark's section about the Galilean women failing to report the resurrection of Jesus to the disciples becomes more understandable. In conclusion, this scholar writes that, quote, Mark's combined critique of the 12, the 3, Peter, Jesus' family, and the Galilean women is directed against people who are identifiable as representative figures of the Jerusalem church. The logic of Mark's critique is also aimed at the very existence of the Jerusalem community. Jesus' closest followers failed to understand the nature of the Galilean community, abandoned Jesus, missed his coronation on the cross, and were thus stalled in Jerusalem, never reaching the goal of Galilee. End quote. Following this assertion, the question then becomes, why did Mark tell his story like this? The key for this problem has to do with Mark's view on the Jerusalem temple in chapter 13. We've noted before that one of the biggest problems faced by post-Pauline Christians was the destruction of the temple. Various authors sought to explain why the temple had been destroyed. If we date Mark's gospel to the period after the war, and if we accept his dim view of the Jerusalem church, then the reason for writing his gospel, the reason for telling the story the way he tells it, becomes clearer. As this scholar notes again, quote, viewed in light of the destruction of Jerusalem, the gospel does not pronounce judgment on the mother church in Jerusalem as much as it seeks an explanation for its extinction. Thus, Mark is not vengeful, holding a personal grudge against the 12, but rather tells his story in a prophetic way, who searches for an answer to a terrible crisis. End quote. Thus, Mark writes his gospel in order to explain the destruction of the Jerusalem church. Put differently, after the temple was destroyed, the church in Jerusalem was also destroyed in 70. Mark, writing around 70, or possibly after 70, tells his story the way he tells it by adopting a negative outlook on identifiable figures associated with the Jerusalem church in order to explain what happened to that church. In conclusion, if we link up the above three themes, the Messianic secret, the blindness of the disciples, and the message Mark contains about the Jerusalem church, is there any kind of overall message that we can discern? It seems to me that there is, and it has to do with the kingdom or the reign of God. Now, this is a notoriously difficult concept to define, but I think we can get some help from the text itself and two important scholars. Jesus' life and teachings point to a certain way of living in the world, a way that involves suffering and death. The disciples' blunderings and the outsider's perception point to the uselessness of insider/outsider assumptions. In fact, the whole gospel can be seen as a parable about the kingdom. Werner Kelber, in his 1979 book, Mark's Story of Jesus, writes, quote, the kingdom is open to all the nations, Jews and Gentiles, as well as to both males and females. It is not hierarchical in structure, but egalitarian in nature. Its fundamental article of faith, love of God and neighbor, overrules all laws and regulations. Most importantly, its central authority is Jesus, who was enthroned not by the power of resurrection, but in the humiliation of the cross. This crucified king teaches the lesson of service and suffering on behalf of others, not the art of self-aggrandizement. As Dominic Crossan writes in his 1994 bestseller, Jesus, a Revolutionary Biography, the The Greek term usually translated as kingdom is basileia. See, our problem is that when we hear the term kingdom, we think of a geographically specific point on a map that we can point to. In Crossan's work, he belies that interpretation, noting that it's more useful to think of basileia as a process of ruling, a reign, rather than a kingdom. He writes, quote, "What we are actually talking about is power and rule, a process much more than a place, a way of life much more than a location on earth. The kingdom of God is people under divine rule, and that, as an ideal, transcends and judges all human rule. The focus of discussion is not on kings, but on rulers, not on kingdom, but on power, not on place, but on process. The kingdom of God is what the world would be if God were directly and immediately in charge." I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments.